Should the next generation, Generation Z, be pursuing marriage? Let's talk about it. I think today, many people, more than what has been a historical precedent, have been choosing not to get married. Some have been choosing to remain single. Some have been choosing to just cohabitate and never make that commitment legally binding to marry that person. And other people have just decided that they're just going to live a life of getting married, getting divorced, getting married, getting divorced, and marrying multiple people. I think in this cultural day and age, there's been a lot of people in Generation Z who have seen their parents either get divorced or have seen friends' parents get divorced, and that hurt has transcended into their mindset. And because of that, there's a lot of Generation Z people who are not really desiring or choosing to focus on prioritizing marriage as one of their goals in life. Now, does this mean that they're not contributing to society? Not necessarily. It could, I think, in some ways, but doesn't have to necessitate that. I do think that marriage and choosing that commitment is a very responsible decision that requires a lot of forethought, and it requires a lot of commitment on your part, and choosing to sacrifice yourself for another person, for your spouse daily, is a big decision to be made. I think part of the reason that this generation is not choosing to participate in that commitment quite as much as previous generations is partially because a lot of my friends and peers that I know who are in this generation have not been really raised with the value of marriage that has been ingrained in their minds. They also have not been raised in a way that develops self-critical thinking, that develops self-sacrifice or patience and kindness towards other people, respect. Now, I will say, I do think Generation Z does put a lot of emphasis and value on respecting other people, on respecting their space and have, roommate situations and all of that type of thing. But I will say a lot of parents have not necessarily set their children well up for success by allowing them to have more and more responsibility as they've grown throughout their life. And because they haven't had that responsibility, they're not at the mental maturity level to make the decision to go ahead and decide to commit their life to someone. They aren't at that maturity because there hasn't been levels of responsibility given to them or allowed for them to make those mistakes in small quantities. And so because of that, they are now, as adults, still in very much a live for myself, just do whatever I want type of a mentality. Now, surely not all of them. There's plenty of Gen Zers out there who are getting married, who are choosing to take on that responsibility. And there's also other Gen Zers who aren't taking on that responsibility, but who are trying to contribute to society and still have values and still develop self-sacrifice in other ways. It's not to say that they aren't there. But I do think they are progressively becoming less and less and less. And I think part of the reason is because when people are raising their children and raising their teenagers, we're still there's one of two things. They're either treating their teenagers like their children and they're telling them, this is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do, to the point where the teenager never has the ability to make decisions for themselves. So once they do become an adult, they have a hard time making those responsible decisions because that has not been allowed in their rearing. However, there are people on the other side who let them make whatever decision they want to make, and so these teenagers end up only being influenced by their peers. We're putting people into peer groups of only people their exact age, so their main source of influence is only people who are in the same stage of life as them. I think in past generations, there's been a multitude of different ages just living in community with one another. It hasn't been like, oh, you're going to go with your fellow 12th graders and that's going to be your main source of socialization. No, in past times, it's been a wide variety of ages that you were exposed to, and so you had maybe a greater sense of maturity growing up because you had people pushing you and giving you sources of wisdom beyond what your age would require or need. And so because of that, you did mature a bit faster. You were ready to make that commitment earlier. That commitment was something that was valued, and there was value placed on that from a cultural standpoint. And so you knew like this was going to be for life if you were going to do this. Because of that, it was done much more frequently. People were encouraged to do that. Whereas nowadays, I think people are encouraged not to get married as young, not to get married at all, to live their life. And living their life means like going on maybe adventures or whatever, or just living for themselves, just doing whatever they want. And I'm not saying that that's in every situation. Some people genuinely choose to be single for the sake of self-sacrificing themselves for ministry or for helping other people. Totally fine. I totally get that. However, I do think there is an element of this that there is less responsibility placed on these children as they're growing up. And because of that, they are struggling to gain a greater sense of maturity than we have at the same age in the past. Now, a lot of people will talk about how your brain isn't fully developed till you're 25 or 28, whatever. I would say that if we look at historically speaking, a lot of people still got married very young. They valued that commitment. That commitment was a commitment, and they literally got married for life, and they stayed married, and they just chose each other and chose to value one another. And I'm not saying that was the case in all situations. Surely there were situations that were an exception to that. But the point was, because that was so valued in that society and in that culture, it was just you, that was your choice. You get married, you stay married. And if you didn't get married, that was fine. But they were the more of the exception of society. Tell me what your thoughts are about this concept of getting married later. Why do you think that this generation has been getting married later and not at all opting out of this commitment and choosing other aspects such as cohabitation or multiple partners or whatever? Let's chat about it. If this conversation intrigued you or any sort of thing like this, I try to challenge cultural narratives that we have in this Western culture and in the United States in particular. So if that interests you, go ahead and click that subscribe button. I would love to chat, and let's continue the conversation.